Hi everyone, today we're going to be reading George's Marvellous Medicine, and this is a book that is pretty special to me. I remember getting it when I was at school, running home with the copy and sitting in my bedroom until I'd finished it. So I'm going to read it to you chapter by chapter. Now, at the beginning of the book there is an important message, and it says, warning to readers. Do not try to make George's Marvellous Medicine yourselves at home. It could be dangerous. So none of that. Chapter 1. Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up to any mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him think of just what kind of mischief he could get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, Now, you heard your mother, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, said George. And just try to behave yourself for once in a while. Yes, Grandma, George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there was never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grisly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, Grandma said to George. That'll keep you out of mischief. Yes, Grandma, said George. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small, puckered-up mouth, just like a dog's bottom. How much sugar would you like in your tea today? George asked her. 1 spoon, she said, and no milk. Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, Well, how are you this morning? Or, why don't we have a game of snakes and ladders? Or, how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. It's not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in. George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred again and he took it carefully into Grandma. Where's the saucer? She said. I won't have a cup without a saucer. George fetched for a saucer. And what about a teaspoon, if you please? I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well. I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much, she said. Fetch me a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were at home, Grandma never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she started treating him badly. You know what's the matter with you? The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of her teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy. But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said. Of course you can, she snapped. Growing's a nasty, childish habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never become grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I still growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only a little, the old woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all those other nasty childish habits like laziness, Disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of those things, have you? I'm still only a little boy, said George. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short that she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself growing? George asked her. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma, said George. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh, no, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in, so much the better. Ugh, said George. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Well, Mummy's as stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few caterpillars in it. Slugs too. Oh, not slugs, George cried out. I can eat slugs. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You're joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all because they go crunch. Oh, Grandma, that's beastly, said George. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside a stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. Oh, I don't want to hear about it, said George. A big, fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be very quick, my dear, when you put one of those on your tongue, because it's got a pair of sharp nippers on the back end, and if it grabs your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first. Chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging away towards the door. He wanted to get as far away from this old woman as he could. Now you're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing her finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from your grandma. Little George stood by the door, staring. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He'd always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he wasn't so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she said, beckoning him with a horny finger. Come closer to me, and I will tell you secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind that a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over here to Grandma. She'll whisper some secrets to you. George took a step backwards. He was edging closer to the door. You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma, she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backwards. Some of us, she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a throaty sort of voice that George had never heard her use before. "Some of us," she said, "have magic powers that can twist the creatures of the earth into wondrous shapes." A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. "Some of us," the old woman went on, "have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry at the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets." George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. "We know how to make your nails drop off and your teeth grow out of your fingers instead." George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him most of all. The frosty smile, the brilliant unblinking eyes. "We know how to wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you." "Grandma," he said, "stop, stop." "We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other." George made a dive for the door. "It doesn't matter how far you run," he heard her saying. "You won't get away forever." George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. That's the end of chapter 1.